Anthony Tas Tasgal. Welcome.
Good morning, Johan.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I'll be brutally honest. I think it's going to be fascinating. But for people who don't know you since before, what is it that you do, and why does that feel important to you?
I think on Google now it describes me as one word, author, which is interesting. As I mentioned to you, I like to get called Tas since I've been known that since I was even shorter than I am now. And actually, conveniently, it now also works as an acronym. So if people want a sort of 3-word description of me, I'll say trainer, author, strategist.
Did you set out to be an author?
It's funny. I'd always loved books. I've always been a voracious reader. And I'm sure we'll get onto this later, Johan, but I studied Latin, Greek, and ancient history at university. I was obsessed with stories and books and writing. And I'd always did a little bit of sort of writing as well as speaking. And I did think one day, I'd like to have a go. And here we are 7 books later. So
there's something, because I've obviously had to confront it with one book under my belt as well. There's something, because I have this reverence around authors, ideas, books. Always been an avid reader and really felt a connection through books to something much greater. And it's weird that I can't really internalize the identity to me. Almost like it's, I don't allow, it's almost like an ego thing. I don't know, does it get easier with time? Because you obviously are an author.
Yes, I've sort of come to that conclusion now. I came across a quote which I think might be from sort of Cicero in Latin, aut libri, which is a beautiful pun in Latin. It means you either have children or books. I've managed to just about to have both. Not 7. Thank God I haven't 7 children, or 3 children, which is enough. But no, I'm quite comfortable with that now. And because I do a lot of speaking as well, I just find all of those sort of different legs, the speaking, the writing, and the training, and also just working with brands and on strategy and communication. I think one of the joys of that is actually being able to dip in and out and pick things from one area and learn things from one area. And that's what I think just keeps me curious, really.
So one of the things that I look forward to discussing today is kind of the art of storytelling, but through a very specific lens as well. You mentioned Cicero and the Romans and these very old ideals. You're a marketer by trade, an ad man.
I'm an ad man, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Or at least you were. How did you end up so fascinated by storytelling?
Well, in a sense, it was like a return, really. So the second act. So my first act was, as I said, I studied Latin, Greek, ancient history since I was like a child, and had always assumed I was going to go into academia. And I had a sort of possible job in that area. And then I met, as often these things do, I met a woman, and she wanted to go into work, so she worked in market research. So I thought, okay, I'll try having a proper job. So I applied for this thing called advertising, and especially something called account planning, which people have said is a bit more. It's not just pouring Perrier, which is what account managers do. And I didn't think I was up to like being a creative or an art director or a writer. So I thought it'd be quite interesting because it was about psychology, it was about human behavior, and I thought advertising, if you like, was about creating stories. So I fell into the sort of world of account planning, and then made 2 discoveries. One was that an awful lot of brands didn't seem to want to tell stories; they just wanted to beat consumers around the head with facts, which I always thought was maybe not the right way to do it. And secondly, I was exposed to more presentations than I ever thought possible, almost all of which were unbearably dull. So because I hadn't lost my interest in Homer and Virgil and everyone else, I thought, well, actually, why don't we apply some of the thinking or some of the ideas or just some of the practices of storytelling, whether it's in order to make brands more relevant, motivating, emotional, or even make our presentations less awful to watch. So all the time, these were sort of going under the surface. So after working quite a while in the ad industry, and then getting bored with the idea that the answer to every question was a 40-second television commercial, I thought I'd give it a go back to my first love, and look at how I could use storytelling in both of those areas. So that's sort of the origin story, really, I think.
It's interesting because you could absolutely argue that Homer went viral a couple of thousand years ago and
Yeah.
sustained the virality for a couple of thousand years, which is really impactful. And we're kind of drenched in information,
Yeah.
but lack stories a lot. Like my world has been strategy for the last 15 years.
Mm.
And strategy is a lot about selling the vision of where are we going and what's unique and perhaps a little bit contrarian in how we do it. So storytelling fits into that perfectly. And both in the internal narrative of how do we build engagement and the external narrative, how do we build attraction. But
Yes.
I do think that my reflection is that so few people are good at storytelling. It really feels like a lost art in many ways.
It is one of the I have a number of sayings and mantras, which I'm sure we'll talk about over the next hour. So one of them is that numbers numb us, but stories stir us.
Mm.
So after a while, our brain just gets numbed by sort of numbers, facts, information, just by being bludgeoned into submission. But stories stir our emotions.
Mm.
So again, as in most Latin languages, Romance languages, motion and emotion are the same.
Mm.
So
Yeah, that's
in
good.
English, we say, I feel moved. I was moved
Mm.
by that. I was moved by that music. So you're absolutely right. So I often say my role, my mission, if I use that humble term,
Hmm.
is to restore storytelling, restore the lost art of storytelling. And you mentioned the word strategy. So again, as somebody that used to be a planner in ad agencies, I'm legally obliged to use the word strategy at least once every half an hour. So we're doing quite well. It's only about 15 minutes. And again, when you and I have talked in the past, Johan, you know how obsessed I am with etymology, where words come from. And strategy is what I think is quite a fascinating word, because when I lecture at universities to students, they'll say, oh, it's very complicated. We've had to read loads of books about strategy or loads of articles about strategy. I say it's actually really simple. If you go back to the origin of the word, strategos is the Greek word for a general. So I just say, imagine a general standing on the top of a mountain, and in the background are the enemy, their infantry, their cavalry. So the general's decision is how do they deploy their own infantry? How do they arrange them? And the word for arrangement in Greek is taxis, from which we get tactics.
Mm.
So I would say strategos is just you're on the top of a mountain. You're having the big picture. That's all a strategy is. And the best way of making a big picture come to life, I think, is through having a story. And I think good leaders, good speakers, good statesmen, politicians know that. And there's a great book, it's over there, I'll dig it out later, by a man called Philip Collins, not the guy who was in Genesis. Who was Tony Blair, the UK Prime Minister's speechwriter. And it's a really interesting book about great speakers through the past. And he talks about Pericles in Peloponnesian War. He talks about Martin Luther King. He talks about at least one, if not both of the Obamas. And again, when you look at these people, you realize that ability to tell a story and create empathy is a really important feature, not just for sort of politicians and statesmen, but for leaders, people who call themselves strategists. And as I say, it's part of what I'm interested in, which is how do you create that sense of empathy and emotional sort of involvement with an audience.
Do you find that, I would imagine that for the Greeks, for example, or for the Romans, there wasn't necessarily a separation between the world in which they inhabited, they lived, the kind of rational, logical world, and the mythical world. And do you find that the very distinct separation that we've tried to do, especially in the business world, around like fact, logic, goes against our ability to tell successful stories?
I think I need about half an hour to answer that one. Yeah,
It's interesting, right?
two or three. Well, let me try and unpack it. Because you mentioned rational, and when you say rational, I immediately have to put my behavioral economics hat on.
Mm.
So my three areas that I sort of write and talk about, storytelling is one, then behavioral economics and insight, and I'm sure we'll talk about all of those. So when you talk about rationality, you're right. We've become, in sort of broad Kahneman terms in business, we become absolutely focused on system 2 and facts and rationality.
And system 2, for people who don't know that specific work, is
what Kahneman's popularized, a man called Stanovich came up with, it was system 1 and system 2. So there are two processes going on in our brains all the time in parallel. And it's a slightly artificial division, but it's still worth using. So system 2 is your conscious, rational brain, which is hopefully listening to what I'm saying now later and thinking about it. But system 1 is your unconscious or your subconscious. And Freud was half right. It's very powerful. Kahneman calls it the secret author of our choices, which I like. But Freud was wrong in thinking it was just populated by dark Greek myths about incest. But what is happening is that all the things that evolution is working on to make sure that we survive and thrive happen in the unconscious. So our emotions are there to regulate our behavior, to direct our behavior, which is why emotions are so important. So you're right. Business often goes wrong in defaulting to this very narrow, rationalistic, logical way of thinking. And there's a great quote, which I always attribute to a man called David Eagleman, a very bright and annoyingly handsome neuroscientist from Texas. And he says, we don't think the way we think, which I just think is a beautiful piece of writing, apart from anything. So again, when I'm doing training on this with clients or students or whatever, I'll just say, we like to think, don't we, that we're rational, logical, and independent. But I think probably in our heart of hearts, we know that most of the time, that's not true. Bring it back to the other part of your question, Johan, is funny enough, in London, there's a production of The Back Eye, which I'm hoping to see, which for me was just the play that I read in a Euripides play in the 5th century BCE. And it's about Dionysus, the goddess, the god of luxury, indulgence, wine, sexual behavior, etc. And how he tries to come to Thebes. And the king of Thebes, Pentheus, resists that. And it's not too far, I think, to look in at that play and think that was the first way of exploring in a sort of poetic, dramatic way, the difference between the power of the rational, but also not ignoring the power of the emotional. The very play, and spoiler alert, it doesn't end well for Pentheus, is really about not forcing yourself to abandon all of the emotions, and because that is what makes us human. So again, one of the things I think that ties up a lot of what you're sort of suggesting, Johan, and what I've talked about and written about is, in business, we've tried to do that. We've tried to sort of almost minimize, I think, the emotional. And obviously people I work with who are creative know that you can't do that. You shouldn't do that. But often in business, because business is often led by, directed by, I'm going to be rude to various groups of people now, so apologies in advance, accountants, IT people, engineers, academics, scientists. Often they have a way of thinking which, as I say, tends to sort of diminish or actually just abandon anything that is anything is emotional. So a lot of what I'm doing, especially at the higher levels of working with CEOs, CFOs, is just saying to them, do you realize this is what you're doing? And do you realize that you're depriving yourself, your customers, your stakeholders, your colleagues of all the richness that is involved in storytelling and emotion?
Yeah, because one could quite easily imagine in the mental image of the strategist, the general standing on top of the hill, and his troop arrangement. If that is solely a mathematical equation, there's something missing in that we're fighting for something bigger than ourselves, perhaps for the protection of our families, for our legacies, for our freedom, whatever it is. And if you have one strategist who taps into that, that will quite massively impact the troops, the morale of the troops.
Yeah.
I do agree, but do you find that there's a primarily when you talk specifically to the business audience about these concepts, is the reaction a squirming reaction that this feels very uncomfortable, or is it rather a longing for a permission to finally let free? What's the gut reaction that you meet a lot of times?
I know English is not your first language, but that is a beautiful use of like squirming. You're right. A lot of this language, I think, is about, again, acknowledging the human side of behavior. So yes, I do feel. I was in Amsterdam about 2 weeks ago. I think I mentioned to you. Funny enough, working with a Swedish company, Vattenfall. I was working with their procurement people, which I found very odd. I thought, why did storytelling, procurement?
Yeah.
Usually I hear the word procurement and I run away screaming because I've got to spend 3 hours filling in a spreadsheet. But they were really good. They said, no, we are in procurement. We have to negotiate. We have to do deals. We have to understand, again, human behavior. And I found it really refreshing because they were very open. They said, yes, we know we are very spreadsheet driven. My definition of an accountant, by the way, is somebody that really wishes human beings were spreadsheets. And it was really quite refreshing because often when I work with people from marketing or communications or strategy, they're often sort of quite cold and they often don't want to open up. But they were really good about this. So I think that's interesting. And I think there are two emotion, well, one emotion and another, I don't know, whatever it is, that really are incredibly powerful. And I think we have to acknowledge them. And again, partly it goes back to the Greeks. So of all the big 6 emotions, which are there's a big debate about how culturally sort of driven they are. But Paul Ekman came up with the 6 emotions, which are sort of expressions, facial expressions. Anyone who's watching this, if you don't want to listen any further, just watch Inside Out. But then
Oh yeah. I listened to a podcast with him. Now that you mention it, it's a beautiful movie.
It's great. And the second
together with our kids, yeah,
about teenagers.
Yeah.
So if anyone who's listening or watching has teenage children, go watch Inside Out too. So yeah, one of the big 6 emotions, and I would argue probably the most important one for human survival, is fear. And again, I think it is one of those things that we have to be honest about and acknowledge. Because a lot of this is about, self-awareness. And fear drives an awful lot of what we like to think of as rational behavior or gut instinct. A lot of it is fear of doing something different, fear of being exposed, fear of being wrong. Bit of etymology.
Fear is interesting and tricky in so many ways, because one of the consequences of fear, I've been unpacking this for myself a lot, especially over this summer, is that there's a self-censorship that you end up doing a lot around fear. You kind of reverse, justify a lot of decisions or bets that you don't take. And it's tricky. And now it became more psychological than storytelling, but it's tricky because it's so self-censoring that you don't realize that you self-censor as the slave to fear. And it's really empowering to start dealing more directly with fear, pulling it out in the light,
Yeah, I mean, I was about to give another bit of etymology since it's, 10 minutes or so since I've done it, which is error. So we talk about error in English, failure. You've made an error. And again, if you go back to the Latin, errare, errare in Latin means to wander, to sort of veer all over the place. And yes, there's a slight negative element to that. So again, in English, we'll talk about driving erratically. The person was driving erratically.
Did it used to have a negative connotation to it, or is it something that we in the more modern society has assigned to it?
It's more modern because I think it was Tolkien who wrote Lord of the Rings, said, "Not all those who wander are lost."
Yeah, beautiful.
And the Latin era, and also in I think in sort of social sciences and social work, people will talk about aberrant behavior, so behavior that deviates from the norm. Again, deviate is the same Latin word. It means to move away. So via means just route or way. So I always like to say to people, it's okay to make an error, because you're not, all is you're wandering. So I think we've got to legitimize failure.
Do you
And again, I
think that
think
a lot of these kind of negative connotations has arisen through almost like the Christianity culture in a sense? Because when you mention being erratic as something more wandering without a destination, that could also be very
yes.
positive in terms of open, explorative. Do you feel that a lot of these ideals of conformity has arisen through more monotheistic religion?
Um, yeah, I probably should be slightly careful here, but I think you're right. If you look at the Greeks and then the Romans, and then you look at the rise of Christianity, and them trying to sort of remove a lot of what they considered
Mm,
pagan beliefs, again about, you know, sexual conduct, about all sorts of other areas.
mm,
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of authority and control and submission. And again, it's all there in the Bacchae. That's
mm,
exactly what happens. Dionysus says to Pentheus, "Stop trying to control all this. It will end badly." Um, and it does. And I think one of the other things that I throw into the mix, if I can, um, somebody asked me recently, I was talking about behavioral economics, what's the single most important, most significant driver of human behavior? And I usually answer confirmation bias.
mm,
In other words, because our brain, and I haven't really talked about the brain very much, but that's, what drives all of this. Because your brain runs on energy, your brain doesn't want to make the best decision. It wants to make the most effortless decision.
mm,
Because the brain is something like 2% of the average person's body weight, but the brain consumes something like 20 to 25% of all the energy. So I always tell, again, my people I'm training or talking to, stop thinking about the brain as a computer or a sponge. It's actually a muscle, and one that draws energy, needs energy. So anything that makes the brain use less energy is going to be a good idea.
mm.
So think about changing your ideas about something. So whatever you want to think about, what's going on in the world, Donald Trump, whatever, it's not in your brain's interest, having invested all this energy in believing X.
Mm,
Suddenly throw all of that out and invest a lot of new energy in believing Y.
mm,
The reason that economists go wrong, and often business people, accountants, politicians, is they think, you may have your own beliefs, but here are some better ones.
mm.
And that's just not what the brain's interested in. The brain is not particularly a lawyer or a scientist. It's more of a storyteller. And as I say, it's also more interested in conserving energy. So confirmation bias means the brain will go out of its way to ignore anything that doesn't conform with what it already believes.
And
And
how
we
does
see it.
storytelling tie into this? Is it the cheat code to kind of bypass the confirmation bias, or is it to anchor it better into already existing concepts? Or
I'm going to say both. It might seem odd, Johan, but you're right.
yeah,
It is a cheat code. And often when I get asked this, how do you overcome confirmation bias?
mm,
Storytelling is a great way of doing that, because the joy of storytelling, of which obviously I can talk about for ages, your brain is in a different mode. If I start telling you facts or giving you statistics, your brain goes into sort of analytic system 2 mode.
mm,
But if I'm telling you a story with a moral, your brain is in a different sort of mood, different tone.
mm,
And the whole point of me talking about storytelling is to say to people, if you can create a story that is captivating, that is emotional, that draws people in, that makes them care, and then you can slip some facts in there,
mhm,
more likely that you're going to affect people's behavior.
mm,
The other thing you said, which is fascinating as well, because I don't get asked this very often, is the downside of storytelling. So there is something called a narrative fallacy, which
go
is
ahead.
the sort of dark side of what you were just asking me about, Johan. In other words, our brain, because it's designed to think in stories, often we can be misled by the power of storytelling. And again, this is why politicians of all, of all denominations know
Especially
the
the
power.
populists, I would assume that they're
I
quite
was going
good
to
at
say that.
capturing that.
Your words, not mine.
No, but
Um,
that's one of the things. It's also dangerously interesting to experiment with the fact that populists, on average, are excellent storytellers.
yeah.
Whatever you think about their politics, they're really good
Yes,
storytellers a lot of
absolutely.
the time.
Oh, we've opened up a whole new front now here. Yeah, because I'm going to use the word demagogue.
Yeah.
So again, if you look at, I mean, I don't know, you can take this out if you like, Trump, Orban, Putin, whatever. These are, as you say, they're populist demagogues. And again, anyone who's interested, by the way, I'll plug the new book, the classical marketing book.
Yeah, go ahead.
And one of the things I talk about is the power of politics and storytelling. So again, one of my favorite people ever was Aristophanes, who wrote a number of very satirical, very funny, biting political comedies. Again, around the era of Peloponnesian War, 430, 409. And at the time, later on, there was a demagogue called Cleon. And everything you read about Cleon, you can look at demagogues now and in the last several hundred years. Somebody who pretended to be on the side of the people, but was mainly interested in self-enrichment and leading the people to his own ends. And Aristophanes was vicious about Cleon, absolutely hated him. Now, in the US, anyone who's listening around, it's just 22nd of September. Last week, we saw another front opened up by the US government in their attempt to quell any sort of opposition. They took Jimmy Kimmel off air for criticizing, the Trump administration. So for me, I look back at this and I think this has literally got history behind it. For hundreds, thousands of years now, we've looked at people in positions of power who cannot tolerate dissidents. And we look at what they do. So the Trump administration forcing Kimmel off air or getting Colbert not renewed. These are issues, these are topics which, again, go back 2,500 years, which is one of the reasons I still think they're valid.
But if we assume that part of the populist charm is the ability to tell really captivating stories. I remember growing up, I used to love reading fantasy, and especially the kind of rites of passages of young mages, magicians, and experimenting. Wow, I have suddenly all of this power, and there's this choice of will I use it for good or for bad, and there's this tension there as well, and this pull into ego versus service. And I think it's fascinating how uncomfortable we probably are with what can be the dark arts. So much so that we who want to serve the light are afraid, in a sense, of the tactics or the skills of those we see serve the dark. So that we, as a consequence, stay away from storytelling, for example, because we see it as something that only the populist politicians do. But in my world, and it became quite a question of morals here when we talk about politicians. It's so divisive, and to me, the skill sets are quite separate from the content. Right? You have the moral choice what you do with the skill sets, but the skill set in itself is just a skill set, the ability to tell a story. Right? And it's your choice if you use that for good or bad.
Yes. There's a great book. It's on my shelf somewhere. I think his name is Drew Weston, American Democratic Strategist. And it's called, I think, The Political Brain. And he is both a neuroscientist and, as I say, democratic strategist in the US. And it's a fascinating argument that, especially in the US, which is where he comes from, but elsewhere, that generally the right wing, is happier using emotions and stories. He usually he talks more about emotions, and he gives examples of campaigns in the States which were very, very emotional and also quite sort of fear-mongering. And he says, usually in politics, the left are less happy using emotions because they worry that they're manipulating the people. And I think it's a fascinating discussion, and I often get into it. And I think he's right. And in the UK, I can't mention the B word, Brexit, because I will start, I can't go there. But we found that in the UK, the campaign to get Britain out, which was obviously a complete disaster, used fear. It was the fear of immigration. It was all about that and the absence of control and all those sorts of things. So you're absolutely right. I think the politics of storytelling, or the storytelling of politics, is a whole fascinating area. And I think it would be more sensible if we all understood the power of storytelling and then agreed that as long as we understand how it works, that we also understand the narrative fallacy, that we might be leading people by the power or seducing people by the power of storytelling to do what isn't right. I think it would be more sensible if we just understood, as I say, collectively across different societies, cultures, how storytelling can work, so that we're also alert to if it's being used against us.
Yeah, there's two arguments that can be made. You can be more alert to when you're being manipulated, absolutely. But it's also filling the void with storytelling that is in service of something good, right? So
Yes.
it's filling the world with what you believe is the right thing to fill it with.
I wanted to talk a bit about schools, actually, because I have a bit of another mission, actually.
Yeah, go ahead.
Which is at the end of one of my books, I think it was the consumer behavior book, which was one on behavioral economics. I sort of issued a plea to local authorities and governments around the world to bring this to schools. Probably storytelling and also behavioral economics.
Okay.
For me, those are opposite sort of sides of the same coin.
Yeah, I can see that.
You should teach pupils, because increasingly now, not just with social media, but across all media, people are exposed to not just branding message, political messages, social messages. And I think it's really important that people are equipped with these skills from an age of 11, 12, 13, so they know what people are trying to get them to do. So whether it's, buying Nike versus Adidas, or drinking less alcohol, or, voting in a particular way. So I have said this, and I've had a couple of conversations in London with different authorities about trying to bring it into a school curriculum. So behavioral economics, understanding why you are emotionally driven, politicians and brands are trying to target your emotions. And as I said, the other side of that, why you're going to be much more easily seduced by a story. So again, whether it's online, social media, Instagram, whatever, and again, that you're aware of what people are trying to get you to do. I don't know, maybe in 5 or 10 years, we'll see, Johan. But I do
there's
think
so much that I wish that the school, especially in System 1, took a bigger ownership in. I've been reflecting so much about, why do we learn all of the different lakes in Sweden, which I remember was one of the big tests when I was 12 years old, to be able to name all the different lakes. And we have plenty of lakes in Sweden. But why didn't I ever get any, even attempt at or at teaching me about my own relationship to my emotions, for example? Like that's interesting to me. Where do we put our attention? And it's squarely into System 2 all of the time.
Yeah. Again, I was just talking about this, a talk I did about the new book the other day. And again, someone was asking me about my, origin story. And yeah, I remember when I was 14, 15. So we get taught Shakespeare, because you're English, and he's pretty good. They can't argue that. But I remember picking up Oedipus Rex and thinking, I couldn't believe this story, because it was like, and I'm sure I'm not the first person to say this. It seemed to me the world's first detective story. And spoiler alert, it was the detective who did it. And I remember reading the story and thinking, who's Sophocles, and who's Jocasta and Oedipus, and the fact that he realizes gradually it's pieced together. He doesn't want to admit the truth. I thought, this is amazing. I loved, you like fantasy, I like detective stories as well.
Mm.
And then I came across the backer, and I came across all these other examples. And I thought, this is stuff that, are we allowed to read this at school? It felt, and it wasn't
It's fantastic.
mathematical.
And it's also fantastic how modern it often feels. I was surprised. I reread the works, not the complete works, but some of the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes, over the
Yes.
summer.
Yes.
And it is fascinating how absolutely modern it is in its emotions, in its writing. It doesn't read like a book that has the number of years on it that it has. And I would imagine, I haven't read that much actual ancient Greek or Roman literature, but I would imagine it's quite similar, or surprisingly similar.
It is. And again, all these issues, the reason why I've written about it in the book and I talk about it is, I don't know if I used the word timeless yet, but I will now. These are timeless things. These are about discovery. These are about birth. These are about identity. They're about the power of the subconscious. They're about sex, and they're about extraordinarily open. And this was the flowering Greek Renaissance around sort of 5th century, where you effectively had philosophy, tragedy, comedy, democracy, a limited form of democracy, but democracy. You had Plato, and in that short period of time, largely in Athens, but not just, you had this extraordinary outburst, this creation of all these sort of ideas. And an architecture, of course, the splendor of, architecture and the Parthenon. So for me, what's fascinating is just seeing in modern society, and I went on a tour yesterday. We have this thing called Open House in London where you can go on free tours. So I did a couple of them yesterday. So I went to some Roman baths in London. Any big city, a lot of the big monuments, museums, whatever, are based on Greek, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian columns. And why? Because we want to sort of continue that sort of tradition of learning and erudition. So all those things sort of haven't gone away. And again, politics, if you look at the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, again, it's a brilliant story between two completely different characteristics. The Athenians were outgoing and thoughtful and emotional and creative. The Spartans were inward-looking and militaristic. And okay, there's a little bit of simplification in there, but by and large, that was true. It was the original clash of cultures. And if you look at what's going on in global politics now, there's an awful lot of clashes of culture. So again, you can look back and see, I think you used the term right at the beginning, Johan, through the lens. We can look through the lens of the past and think about the present in a different way. And that's another element for me that we can learn from.
When diving deep into the intersection of the ancient wisdom and modern marketing, and what was the kind of surprising revelations for you doing this work?
I think a lot of it, again, what was interesting for me was I learned this at school before I went into advertising. I had no idea, because people said to me, people who knew me when I was, 21 or something, said, sorry, you spent all your life with Homer and Virgil and Aristophanes, and now you're going to work with Peugeot and Cadbury. And so I pointed out that Nike obviously is a Greek word. It's the goddess of victory. Actually, a little bit of it, also a bit of, so not etymology exactly, but brand origins, right? So Nike, again, is the Greek goddess of victory, but people don't know ASICS. So I'll just brief digression for your listeners and viewers. ASICS, which hopefully most people know as a sports brand. And every time I ask people, they'll say, oh, is it basics without a B? No, it's not that. So as a Roman satirist, I talked about Aristophanes, that Juvenal was a Roman satirist in the 1st century CE. And he wrote these, again, absolutely devastatingly violent, aggressive political satires. And he gave us a few expressions that we still use. So he coined bread and circuses. In other words, what you need to keep the people happy. As long as you give them bread and He also said, quis custodiet custodes ipsos. Who will guard the guards themselves?
Oh yeah,
Again, you don't have to look
famous
too
from a
far.
Will Smith movie much later.
Yeah, but you don't have to look too far in politics again to ask that question. But the other thing he came up with is a healthy mind in a healthy body,
Wow.
which again we know. Mens sana in corpore sano, the Latin. Now, the people behind ASICS like that expression, but it didn't quite work, so they swapped. They changed the word mens, which means mind, as in mental. They swapped it for anima, as in animate or animism, which means soul or spirit. So it became anima sana in corpore sano, ASICS, ASICS.
Wow.
So there you go.
Fantastic.
As I can't resist that. But no, I mean, I think one of the other things that I want to pick up that you mentioned was fantasy, because again, so much storytelling is fantasy. I mean, one of the areas that I like bridging between storytelling in its sort of natural form and how we can use it is, I often say when you're doing a presentation, or you're thinking about a brand, think about it as a what if. What if we did this? What if this happened? What if this didn't happen? Because some of the greatest stories we all know are what if stories. So, 1984, what if we imagined a sort of fascistic future? George Orwell again, Animal Farm, if you imagined everything as animals. The one I always ask, again, because I'm a huge film fan, I haven't talked about films very much yet. What if you woke up every day and it was the same day?
Yeah.
Groundhog Day. What if you woke up every day and it was the same day? Groundhog
Is
Day.
Apple's Think Differently campaign part of that idea, would you say?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, and so many campaigns are, good brands are. Great, I think it's called Barocca. It was a vitamin supplement campaign. And I really, really liked their line. And it was you, but on a good day.
Yeah.
And I think there's something clever because it plays into that way that the brain, there's a whole thing about the brain now, which, sorry, this could be a lot. I'll try and cut this down because there's a wonderful thing in behavioral economics called ironic process theory.
Okay.
So if I ask you now and anyone who's watching just to close your eyes for 5 seconds.
Happily.
And don't think of a polar bear. Okay. Most of you will have thought of a polar bear, even though I said don't. And a man called Daniel Wegener coined this ironic process theory. He said your brain often ironically processes the very opposite.
It's funny. It really brought me back. I remember being introduced to this idea when I was 14, 15 years old by my father. Exactly that story. I think it was penguins, but still. And it's come back to me over and over again. And I'm so annoyed by it. I tried to tell my 8-year-old girl it, and she's all, no, I didn't think about it. And it annoys me because I remember it was so powerful for me.
Well, I will say to most people, even if you said you didn't, I don't believe you. Because what happens is your system one, which we've talked about, is that it will throw up a picture of a polar bear. Your system two will go, no, you said don't. And you'll try and come up with a penguin. It's usually a penguin or something. But most of the time you can't stop that because it's unconscious. So a lot of these things are unconscious. And Edgar Allan Poe wrote a lovely story about this. And he called it the imp of the perverse. He says that on your shoulder is like a little imp, like a little devil, and it's telling you to do these things. And it's a great story about a man who's condemned to death. It's a short story. It's a really good story. And he called it the imp of the perverse. But what it means is we often end up saying the opposite or creating the opposite effect from what we want, which again is one of those sort of behavioral economics tricks, if you like, that I quite like. So yeah, it's another one.
Do you find that modern storytelling has tilted more and more towards fear-based storytelling? And the reason why, and how does that perhaps interconnect with the shorter and shorter attention span that we give stories? It's a reel, it's 2 seconds, 3 seconds, and you have to kind of jump directly into the highest possible trigger, which is probably fear-based. Whereas the truly magnetic stories to me is more like you talked about Barocca, like the imagination of who I could be in the best version of myself.
Yeah, it's a really sort of big topic. I think really. You talked about attention. We haven't really talked about attention very much, so let's have a flare on that. Now, I haven't mentioned insight really, which is my third sort of leg. So let me just tell you about an expression that I came up with by accident, because in the Insight book, I talk about insight because I work in planning. A lot of research people present huge tomes of data and try to convince me there's an insight there. Say, no, just because you've given me a huge volume doesn't mean there's an insight. So insight is about showing something new or showing something you thought you knew in a new way. And my favorite quote is that if you science fiction fan, Isaac Asimov, who wrote Foundation books, Foundation Empire, and I, Robot, you mentioned Will Smith, had a great quote. He said, scientists, when they come up with something new, they don't go eureka. They say, that's funny. It's great, isn't it? It's the best definition of insight I've ever heard, because your brain goes, oh, hang on, that's funny. And often your eyes will go up to the northeast, which I think is an NLP thing. And it means, oh, hang on, I haven't thought of it that way before. So I ended up writing a speech for a client, and I was talking about the brain and attention and how do you create attention. And I was typing attention span. If anyone's looking at their keyboard now, you'll see the letters N and M. Certainly most keyboards, I think, in Europe and the US, are next to each other. So I accidentally typed attention spam with an M. And I thought, oh, actually, I quite like that.
Yeah.
So that's become my go-to expression now. Any piece of communication or brand or whatever or speech you're giving, forget the facts, forget even the target audience. Your most important goal is to avoid going into attention spam. Because everyone thinks, everything I say goes from my attention inbox into your attention inbox. But I talked about the brain before. That just can't happen. Most of it will go into what I now call attention spam. So the link then, as you're sort of inviting me to say, I think, is story is a great way of avoiding being sent into the brain's sort of junk folder. Because a good story involves people, involves the emotions, it captivates people, as we've said, and therefore it gives people a better chance of not getting sent into attention spam. Now, fear, which was the other thing you said, I think for the reasons that I talked about in politics, fear is still the dominant emotion probably in politics. When I work with brands and we do an exercise on this, I always caution them about fear. Because fear is very powerful, but you have to be careful because it can also lead to obviously negative thoughts. And so I did talk at a cybersecurity tech conference yesterday, and obviously it's all about fear, the fear of having your data stolen, etc. But I always say to people, if you're going to go with fear, I think you have to temper it with a bit of hope. So anyone who remembers Pandora's box, the story of Pandora's box, which was mistranslation, it's actually a jar, not a box. All the evils come out of Pandora's box, and all that is left is hope. So I'll say to people, yes, fear is powerful, but be careful. But one of the other emotions, that I will talk about a lot is surprise. Because again, surprise is they all have evolutionary roles, as I said to you before. Yeah. And so surprise's role is to interrupt us and say, here's something that you need to pay attention to now because it might affect your chances of survival or thriving. So I'll often say to people, especially people that we've mentioned who are a bit nervous, a bit controlling and strategists, maybe you need to be more open to surprise. Yeah. Because surprise, as I say, can do things to the brain that other emotions can't.
There's so much interesting things to pick up on what you said here now. I do think I want to double click down the thread of... So fear to me is interesting because it fits very well into creating a burning platform which can drive revenue in the very short term, which fits again into the kind of quarter economics of modern business. But there's no real reason to come back to ideas, which I see that you have the reason to do a lot in storytelling. They suddenly pop up when you take a shower or when you go to bed. They kind of continuously evolve and become yours over time, and you interject yourself into these stories. So it's so much potentially more potent, but over time, in a sense. And I do think that this, when you talked about attention spam, it's interesting because there's a huge lesson here as well for our lives in general. And this kind of connects over to a parallel discussion on the kind of evolution of modern knowledge worker economy, which is,
Yeah.
I believe that and it's not my original ideas here, but it's weird how we've kind of transferred the mechanics of the industrialization into knowledge work, and how we started to measure productivity really, really weirdly. And I think a lot of the kind of stress and the feeling of not being enough comes from the idea that you only produce when you can actively be seen as producing. And I'm personally on a mission to really wage war against, for example, distractions. Slack is on my notice a lot right now, because yes, we have this ability to be directly in touch, and there's a kind of false sense of being productive, and you can fill your whole days with just small tasks but move absolutely nowhere towards the mission that you're actually on. And I kind of fantasize about this way of life that I'm striving towards, which is being high impact in everything I do, but choose deliberately what I do. And distraction and attention spam is right in the middle of the problem.
Again, anyone who knows my my work, I haven't mentioned the other word that I like using, which is arithmocracy.
Unpack it.
So arithmos, the Greek word for numbers. So a while ago, when I first wrote the storytelling book, I wrote the whole first chapter, which was, why do we need storytelling? My argument then, and I don't think it's changed because it's coming up to its 10th anniversary, this book, in about a month. And it's managed to sell 40,000 copies globally, which is all right.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I just said, look, and again, it was because I've sort of still partly in the business, advertising, marketing world. I'd noticed a shift, and it's what you've said, but in my particular way, in this particular way, was the obsession with metrics and KPIs and measurement. And I realized that I was like King Canute. I couldn't push the waters back. I wanted to say to people, I think we've gone too far down that end of the spectrum now. Everything has to be about measurement and control, KPIs, productivity, efficiency, again, which is a word that I loathe. Because for me, there's efficiency and effectiveness.
Yeah.
Again, as somebody that used to work in advertising ideas, often you can't prove that these ideas will work, but you have experience, you have creative people, you have planners like me. You say, okay, we think this will work. If you try and measure and predict its efficiency, you're probably going to go wrong. So I felt that I needed to rant about arithmocracy, and it hasn't changed. I don't think if anything, it's probably got worse because of big data. But all I'm saying is to CEOs or CFOs or whoever, I understand why we need metrics. I understand why we need to have these things to measure and budget. I get that. But appreciate, one, that you can't simply measure everything. A lot of things that are important that we've talked about, emotions, quality, the quality of your brand. Well, how do you measure that? So it chimes with what you're saying, I think, Hank, because it goes back to F.W. Taylor's scientific management, where he wanted to think of as workers. He called them intelligent gorillas. And I think you're right. We've transferred a lot of that scientific management to knowledge workers. And the whole point about knowledge and ideas and insight and creativity is, for me, they are all linked, and insight. They are all linked. And we talked about error and wandering. And I think we need to just sort of move away from that. And again, you're right. It's partly a Protestant thing, a Christian thing. This thing about efficiency and doing things the right way and measuring it and control, and all of those things for me are the opposite of what we should be encouraging people, and not just, sort of adults and knowledge workers, but even sort of kids, students.
I wonder what happens if we extrapolate it even further and say that part of probably why the fascination of being able to almost predictively prove the efficiency of something, model it out, business case it out, lean on logic behind all decisions, perhaps also comes as a consequence of our de-religionization. Sorry, my English finally fell through there. But like we most of us don't have a conscious relationship with faith. Like I can't prove it, but I know it to be true, and therefore I look for proof that I can feel and measure. So it's not even just a Christian thing. It's a complete move away from everything that's not observable in the more scientific way.
Yeah. Fate, right? Okay, we've got to fate now. Destiny. I've been watching. I don't know if you're watching on Netflix, Sandman.
No.
Neil Gaiman's series. And again, it's an interesting blend of different myths, a lot of Greek stuff in there, and a lot of his own thinking. And he, the main character, Sandman, is dream. So there's a lot about dream, but also destiny, desire, delirium. And you can't study Greek, Roman sort of mythology without looking at fate and destiny. And they had different words for that, and they had different ways of thinking about it. So you had the Oracle of Apollo. And the thing that Greeks were very smart about was they realized that often the oracle wouldn't give you the exact truth. It would give you a slightly ambiguous. And there's a very famous story, and it's, I can't remember, I think it's Darius, king of Persia, who goes to an oracle and says, should I invade Greece? And the oracle says, if you invade Greece, a great empire will be destroyed.
Yeah, but you don't know if it's yours or theirs.
And it turns out it's his empire.
Yeah.
So one of the things that, again, I think is brilliant about sort of, Oedipus Rex, the play, etc., is this sense of irony.
And
the Greeks,
it's funny, before you move on, such an interesting confirmation bias happening there as well, because if I remember the story correctly, he naturally interprets it as the enemy's empire, right?
Yeah. Also, I'll get just a slight diversion. I talked about the Spartans before. In English, we have the word laconic, which means very sort of short and concise. And that laconic is another word for Spartan. The Greeks call them Spartiae, but also Lacedaemonioi. And there's a couple of great quotes that I use about the Spartans. I think one of them is from Plutarch. And one of them is incredibly concise, but it shows a fantastic understanding of Spartan military culture. So the Spartans would carry their shields into war. And there's an expression that was attributed to Spartan mothers when they sent their sons to war. And in Greek, I can't get it, it's right, F-hair or N-hair, literally translates either on it or with it. You either come back with your shield, so you survived, or you come back dead on the shield. Philip of Macedon was going to attack Sparta before he took over Greece, father of Alexander. And he sent a message to the Spartans saying, if I invade Sparta, you will be destroyed. And the Spartans just wrote back, if. And again, as somebody that's interesting in story, it's a brilliant piece of communication. It shows that you don't need to write, sometimes incredibly concise.
That's one of the beauties, I think, in general of writing and kind of grappling with ideas And uh, is this your quote? I seem to have it somewhere. Smart people make complicated things simple. Dumb people do the opposite. Is that your quote?
It's Ernest Hemingway
Okay.
phrase. I use it a lot, but no. I mean, I think it's one of the things that no one's entirely sure, but probably Ernest Hemingway. And it is a great quote because, again, if you look at people in strategy or the higher levels of business, that whole thing of jargonification of
Yeah,
making
absolutely.
things sound more clever. One other word I don't think we've mentioned very much, which you were talking about in the previous question you asked me, Johan, was about efficiency and productivity. The word that we need to encourage more of is play.
Yeah.
And I think I've talked about this, and we have people in common who. And again, I think there was a Scottish band from the 80s, 90s called Hue and Cry. I'm trying to bring as many different cultural references into this, by the way. So if anyone's not familiar with the band Hue and Cry, a guy called Pat Kane had a different life, and he started researching the idea of play, especially in Scandinavia, actually. And he wrote a book called The Play Ethic, as opposed to the work ethic.
Mm-hmm.
And this, again, I'm guessing it was maybe 25, 30 years ago. And again, I thought it was really interesting. And he did look at Scandinavia, and he did look at other cultures where playing is okay, playing is creative, rather than, again, putting people into kindergartens and schools from a very young age and forcing them into a particular, you allow them to play. And obviously the whole Lego, the culture of Lego in Denmark. And again, I think that does sort of, as it were, play into everything that we've been saying about storytelling, about ideas, about creativity, the opposite of efficiency, the opposite of arithmocracy. So again, when I talk to people about education and schools, part of it is saying allow people to play more.
Yeah, and also not separate play and work. That's been one of my realizations from a discussion with Erik Ringert, a previous guest on the podcast. He observed very interestingly to me that people tend to kind of naturally accept that while playing you can be very creative, and you see a lot of creativity in playful professions such as stand-up comics, for example, and they're fantastic storytellings. That's how we ended up discussing it before when we met last. But his concept was that in a work environment, you around the kind of startup Google style of organizing, you have ping pong tables and you have all of these kind of artificial playful things at the office. And he observed that, but that's wrong. It's not work then play. It's when you really want to get into creativity, it's working playfully. And that to me was such an interesting nuance to play and work as well. And there's a certain level of the worse the economy in a company, for example, the less they tend to afford themselves playfulness. But probably it's when they need it the most. So we think about playfulness as something almost as a luxury, right? And I think it's true no matter where you look. If you're intensely unsatisfied with kind of your life or where your mental space is, you're never playful, right? You're being more and more strict on yourself. So I think it's brilliant they bring it up, and this is for me an area that I'm just starting to explore, and I'm looking quite forward to lean in more towards. What are your insights? What can you give us on it?
Yeah, there's another quote which I think is George Bernard Shaw, the English writer, playwright. He said, we don't stop playing because we get old. We get old because we stop playing."
Yeah, I've heard it. It's fantastic.
And that's again a nice sort of little, piece of thinking. And you're right. I mean, I think that you mentioned comedy, right? So I've got to talk about this now. I've always been interested in comedy, not just Aristophanes, but just modern comedy. So I grew up with Monty Python and all sorts of. And I've always actually written and performed a bit of comedy, including stand-up. But one of the things that I've again sort of learned, especially with insight, really, and I talk about it in the Insight book. Insight for me has the same feeling as comedy. So an insight for me is like a punchline to a joke.
And
So
there's that element of surprise that you were talking about before as well.
Exactly. And there's the technical term, which again, I wouldn't worry if no one remembers, in Greek is paraprosdokian, which means it goes against what you expect. So again, the example I usually use, 2 fish in a tank, and one says to the other, how do you drive this thing? Because your brain is going one direction and then suddenly it's yanked in another direction. And that is the feeling of insight. It's the feeling of, so I think good comedy does that. And again, that's why stand-ups, and it goes back to what we said about, what's happening in the US. What they'll do is they'll show us the world, but they'll show us it slightly askew, or show us a slightly different behavior.
And I think that's true for great strategy as well, and great innovation as well. It's not necessarily completely foundational research and something. Suddenly we unlocked quantum computers. Like most great innovation is actually the combination of 2 already existing things.
Yes.
But packaged together, they deliver a value that wasn't available before. And there's a surprise to it, and there's an element of delight in it.
Yeah, I mean, that idea, again, of insight, putting things together, and I use a couple of examples. One, because, again, I'm a film fan, which is Mel Brooks, who's, comic genius. He wrote about, when he was writing The Producers back in the 60s, he said, I had an idea about sort of some business people trying to swindle old ladies for money. And I had an idea as well about how could you make the worst play ever written. And he said one day those ideas just came together. And the same was said about Suzanne Collins. Said she was in a hotel room one night. She was flicking through the channels on the television. And on one channel there was a war documentary. And the next channel there was a reality game show. And she said that's how the Hunger Games was born. She literally said, what happens if you put them together? And you see creative people and writers and scientists doing this all the time, saying...
But coming back to openness of like, in order to be able to put those 2 together, you have to, again, be open to those expressions. And again, it all kind of comes back to probably fear. I think it's so... The more fearful and self-limited you are, the less open you are to kind of seeing those things. And it's interesting, you talked about human emotions. One of the emotions that I've been deliberately trying to introduce into my life is the feeling of awe, which is lost, or was lost in my life for quite a long time. And it's also one of those things that's almost 100% dependent on openness, because awe can exist in the smallest of things, the way the light touches a tree or whatever. It doesn't have to be the kind of profound moments in life that actually when your first child is born, obviously you can feel awe at that time, but it's so present, but we don't see it.
And awe is considered to be one of the next level emotions, not the big 6, but and again, it's slightly been devalued by this expression of awesome, which is,
which is a completely different thing, though.
It is. I mean, often the word is used, the sublime. And again, I'm interested in art, and if you look at art creates awe. And I think there's a term for it. I think it's called Stendhal syndrome. The French writer who said he went to, I think it was the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, and there was, I forgot what it was. There was a painting, and he said, I literally stared at this painting and I was transported. And again, that's interesting because that's a word we use in storytelling. Storytelling transports you.
Yeah, absolutely.
The sense of awe, and the sublime. Now, again, I don't want to get carried away and say, well, advertising, but sometimes really good ideas, whether they're in advertising or they're pieces of art or things that people say, or that sense of awe, I think, is something we should always be aiming towards. And, sort of great art and great thinking, great movies, I think can create that sense of awe. And I think you're right. Fear is the enemy of awe.
Yeah, it is 100%. How to approach this practically and trying perhaps to close this conversation, which has been fantastic, Tas. Very thankful for it so far.
Great.
But say that you're a business person, Monday morning. What do we bring with us? Because it's so philosophical, so existential, built around a lot of almost self-work in order to be kind of open, less fearless, more audacious in a sense. But how to approach this? What are the kind of practical steps that we can walk through?
I think the practical steps are, firstly, just stepping back from efficiency.
Yeah, the business of all things.
Yeah, the worshipping at the altar of efficiency, as I like to say, is going to get you nowhere. I mean, if you're an accountant, fine, maybe, or procurement, I get that. But we all have lives. I always say to people when they look at when they write their own descriptions on LinkedIn or a CV, I'll say, "Come on, there's no you here. You make yourself sound like just another worker, or just another, And often when I'm students, I'll say, you speak 3-4 languages. You're interested in art. Bring that. That's the bit. And I think in business and work, we need to bring more of that to our jobs, to our cultures. And I think good companies and cultures are doing that now. And I think whether it's changing because of people working more from home after COVID, I don't know. Because I own 3 children. And my daughter is she's just gone to the BBC to work now to do some research. So, and I'll say, do lots of other stuff. And she's having a sabbatical. She's traveling. And it's great that young people can do this because she will see things which are awe-inspiring. We don't know. That's the joy of it. We don't know because of our brain. If we go to an exhibition, right? So I'm a huge fan of the surrealists. I love Magritte, Dali, whatever. And I went to Sicily and I saw lots of great Greek architecture. I don't know where those ideas will go, but I know that some point in the next weeks or months or years, they will lead to something. So I often say, again, it's under insight, Johan, is I have a folder on my computer and I call it PUD, which I borrowed from a man called Stephen Jay Gould, a scientist. It stands for previously unapplied detail. So sometimes I'll do it on my phone, like if I'm reading a book, I'll just write a note and I'll put it into my PUD file. I don't know what I'll do with it, but if I'm on a train or a plane and I'm bored, I'll look at this folder and I guarantee my brain will go, oh, okay, do you know what that might be? So that's a practical thing that I recommend to people. You do this individually, but also you do it as a company, as a culture. You have an intranet where you have that equivalent, where people can just put in, went to the football the other day, Man United, and just guess, or I saw this piece of art, or I read this article. And if everyone, you use it, it becomes a sort of cultural hive mind for insight. And I think that is
giving yourself permission to step back in order to do those things. Yes. And I completely agree with the kind of manic obsession around efficiency and how easily it creates a lot of movement without direction.
Yeah. And I know a number of companies, especially some of the bigger famous ones who can afford to, will say to people, you have 1 day a week where you can do whatever you want.
Yeah, Google is famous for that. I don't know if they still have that practice in place though, but they for sure did for a while.
I think it's brilliant. Now, okay, there's a efficiency, implication. But if you want to keep, and also I think keeping people happy, we haven't really talked about happiness much. And I think all the things I've talked about storytelling and playfulness and the things that you talked about the opposite of efficiency, I feel they will make us happier people. And I think if we're happier people, obviously there are all sorts of benefits, but it will make us better at what we do as well.
100%. I feel there are kind of a massive agreement with, or sentiment that the current way of doing things isn't working. I think a lot of what we're missing is that, but what do we do instead? And if you don't, since you're into the kind of behavioral economics, I remember reading about a study that was a group of students who were kind of challenged to put away their social media for 30 days. And there were two groups who were being studied, and one group kind of white-knuckled it, just cold turkey, quit it, didn't manage the 30 days. And you had this other group that really filled it with something else, and were quite aggressive in terms of putting things in that was positive. And I think it's the same here, that we all experience that the busyness of just doing things for the sake of doing them doesn't work, but we don't really have the recipe or have spent enough time to understand the recipe, but what do I fill it with instead? And that is a story that needs to be written, a manifest for kind of the modern office worker in a sense, because I don't think people are happy. I think that's quite clear.
No, and I think you're right. And there's obviously the study of happiness. There are different, again, Greek words. So happiness is not just hedonaire, as in hedonistic. That's pleasure.
Yeah.
You need some pleasure, but you also need satisfaction. So there are three elements of happiness: hedonaire, pleasure, but also satisfaction and the absence of dissatisfaction.
Yeah.
And I think that's the third one that we often forget in our work. Often we create so many elements that are dissatisfying to us. So there's no point in trying to make people happy and joyful and play table tennis if there are lots of elements of dissatisfaction. And one of the words that's used a lot in the happiness literature is, again, a Greek word, eudaimonia, which means flourishing. I think that's a better word. I've forgotten the guy's name who wrote about happiness. It will come back to me after we finished. This idea, eudaimonia, the idea that you're flourishing. So again, the American, Czech, American, Hungarian guy, Csikszentmihalyi, talks about flow. We've all heard about flow.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whether you're writing, you're speaking, whether you're running, that moment where you're in flow, everything just feels. Again, we need to create more opportunities, I think, in our work lives to feel flow. And again, it's not something we're going to sort out in the next 5 minutes, Johan, or in the next week. But I think however we can continue this, I think it's got to be something that works. And as I say, my children are in their sort of 20s and 30s now, and it's their generation that I think needs to start putting this into practice. Some of it's happening maybe, but it's not really yet widespread.
What was the word for the not having friction or not having dissatisfaction? What was the word for that?
I know the one you mean. It's just got up my head now. Yeah.
Anyway, the point I was making wasn't necessarily about the word. It was just me being interested in it. But I do think the pull not to feel discomfort, I think, is partly also what pulls us into the doom scrolling, because it kind of soothes that itch of uncomfortableness, right? Releasing dopamine really, really quickly. And Angela Duckworth famously wrote Grit, talking about how we don't really have a relationship to when things are going against us, in a sense. And it's interesting. All of these kind of ideas and concepts are fundamentally the same. And I think the most fascinating takeaway for me, at least in this conversation, is how we undervalue system one, in a sense, and the massive cost of doing it. Like once you start unpacking it, as we've been doing today, like there's the hugest of upsides in becoming persuasive in your storytelling for your business career, whatever, but fundamentally and even more importantly for your own flourishing, right? And how we're not built.
Completely left field thing, maybe to finish with, was that I, as a classicist, I took some friends around the British Museum recently to show them the Roman and Greek galleries. And one of the things you have to show them is the Rosetta Stone, because it's the most visited exhibit in the British Museum. And it's a fantastic story about how it was discovered and deciphered. And there was, again, it's an Anglo-British argument as ever. So there was a guy called Thomas Young who just did an awful lot of the discovery. But the French guy, Jean-François Champollion, was the guy who finally did the decipherment after Napoleon. And it's a brilliant story, and I recommend anyone to read it because it just has so many layers. But the thing I just thought might tie some of this up was the guy Thomas Young was often said to be one of the last men who knew everything. Because you had that Enlightenment era. No, but you had that Enlightenment where the division between like science and art didn't really exist. Newton had originally been an alchemist. He believed in alchemy before. And you realize that that division now, not just between system 1 and system 2, but between art and science is also quite negative. So again, one of the areas I think that ties up, and use the word thread, I haven't mentioned the golden thread yet, which is very unusual for me. A story is always about a golden thread. So I think that thread that's run through this conversation, maybe, Johan, is about trying to reconcile.
Yeah.
And E.O. Wilson, another biologist, he'd use the word consilience, which means to jump together, not resilience, but to jump. And I think one of the things about making things jump together or link together or threaded together is, again, art and science. And I'm saying this partly because the book that I've written that's coming out next year, Johan, is called Putting the Art Back in Marketing, which is, again, as we've said, reducing this obsession with science, and often the wrong science, which is physics, and trying to bring a bit more art into marketing. Because, again, I think that will help us all. So
yeah, and I think we've created this idea of a very false dichotomies, that these are actually polar opposites and one can only be true. And I think that's dangerous and quite sloppy thinking, to be honest. But we need more independent thinkers in order to kind of unpack this in the modern environment. Tas, this has been a fantastic conversation. I'm so thankful for your time, and I wish you all the best with the current book and the coming books. And thank you for being on and sharing your wisdom.
Pleasure. And I've got to say, we've roved across such territory, Johan. I don't normally it's much more narrow, and it's about stories or about, but we've covered all sorts of topics which I never would have expected. So it's been a pleasure.
That's the beauty. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Speak to you soon.